I signed the order that grounded her on a Tuesday, in a plywood room that smelled of burnt coffee and diesel, and I did not think about it again for 11 days. That is the part I have never been able to put down, not the 11 days, the not thinking. You should understand what kind of man I was then, because the story does not work if you imagine me as a villain. I was not. I was the air mission commander for a task force strung out along a river the maps called the Sur, in a country of high stone and thin air where the roads were older than any flag we carried. My job was to move aircraft and the people inside them like a man moving weights on a scale, this much lift here, this much fuel there, this crew up, this crew down. I was good at it. I had spent 19 years learning to be good at it. And the thing about being good at that particular job is that it teaches you to see pilots as numbers, and to trust the numbers over the pilots, because the numbers do not have pride and the pilots do. Her number that Tuesday was bad. Chief Warrant Officer Marsh, everyone in the wing called her Ash, and I will get to why had, 2 weeks earlier, broken a hold. We had put a flight into a cordon over a village called Herat something, one of the dozen names I have let go soft, and the ground element had gotten into a fight worse than the intelligence promised. The mission profile said the gun birds held north of the ridgeline until the forward air controller cleared them in. Ash did not hold. She came over the ridge low and hot with no clearance in her ears, put 30mm into a tree line that was about to fold a squad of our own, and pulled off before the FAC had finished keying his mic. 11 men walked out of that village who, by every honest reconstruction we did afterward, would not have. And she had done it against the profile, against the hold, against the tidy architecture of the thing. The board did not care about the 11 men. The board cared about the architecture. There is a word we used, airmanship, that is supposed to mean the whole of a pilot's judgment, and there is a way of using that word so that it means did she do what the paper said, and the board used it the second way. They wrote her up, reckless, a pattern of aggression, a crew integrity concern. Words that, stacked, mean we do not trust her to obey us, dressed up as we do not trust her to be safe. They needed a signature from the operations side to make the grounding stick pending review. That was me. I read the packet. I read the profile she'd broken and the 11 names she'd saved, and I want to tell you I agonized, but I did not. I had a scale in my head and her weight came up wrong, and I signed. I told myself I was protecting the mission from a pilot who thought she was bigger than it. I told myself a lot of things that were true in the small way that the wrongest things usually are. She did not argue. That is the second part I have never put down. I expected her in my doorway. They always come to your doorway, the ones who get grounded, wanting you to feel it, and she never came. I saw her twice in those 11 days, both times on the flight line, in flight suit and no helmet, watching other people's aircraft go up into the gray. She had a way of standing that I did not have a word for then and have since decided was the way a person stands when they have made peace with a thing without agreeing to it. She was not sulking. She was studying. She watched every launch like she was flying it in her head, the whole approach, the whole gorge, and I remember thinking, she can't let it go, and filing that too as a mark against her. I had it exactly backward. She was not failing to let it go. She was keeping current the only way they'd left her. She was the best gun pilot in the task force. I knew that. Everyone knew that. It was in the way the FAC said her call sign, half a prayer, and they had put her behind glass, and she had decided that behind glass she would at least stay sharp enough that if the glass ever broke she would be ready to walk through it. The glass broke 11 days later, on a Saturday, in the Colwyn Gorge. They called her Ash for the least dramatic reason a call sign is ever earned, which is the only kind of reason that ever really sticks. There was a fire, years before my time with the task force, at a training field back in the world, a fuel spill, a flash, a crew chief on the ground with his sleeve alight. The story is that she was walking to her own aircraft, that she did not run because running would have fanned it, that she crossed 40 meters at a walk, put the man down, and beat the fire out of his arm with her flight gloves in her forearm, and did not make a sound the whole time. When it was over, she had to burn up the inside of her left arm the color and shape of a birch branch, and someone said she'd walked through fire like it was weather, and after that she was ash. She never told the story herself. I got it from a crew chief who got it from a maintainer who had been there, which is how the true ones always travel. I tell you this because I want you to see the shape of her before I show you the gorge. The men who ran her review saw a pilot who broke holds. I have come to believe that everything they filed as aggression was the same thing that walked 40 meters at a walk into a fire. A person who had removed panic from her own hands so completely that when everyone around her was doing the loud, frightened, correct thing, she could do the quiet, terrifying, right one. That is not the same as recklessness. It is the opposite of it. Recklessness is not feeling the risk. What she had was feeling it entirely and deciding anyway, on time, with her hands steady. And that is the rarest thing in the whole trade, and we grounded it because it would not stay inside the lines we drew for lesser pilots. She was 34. She flew an Apache the way a surgeon holds a blade, not gently exactly, but with a total economy, nothing wasted, no motion that was not paid for. Her gunnery scores were the kind the range officers double-checked. She could put the chain gun where her eye went, and her eye went to the right place a half-second before anyone else's, which in that aircraft in that country was the difference between a corridor and a coffin. And on the Saturday the battalion went into the Colwyn Gorge. She was in the ready shack with a book, off the schedule, off the flight line, a pilot we had decided we could do without. We were about to find out what that decision cost. The Colwyn Gorge is not on any map you will ever see, because I have changed its name the way I have changed all of them, but the shape of it is true, and the shape is the whole problem. Picture a knife cut through a mountain, 12 kilometers long, the walls going up better than 300 meters on both sides, near vertical in the middle stretch, and at the bottom a road and a river running side by side because there is nowhere else for either of them to go. The river was the Sur. The road was called the Faison Track, and it was the only ground route between the lowland bases and a cluster of villages at the far end, where the task force needed to put a battalion, better than 800 Marines with their vehicles, their guns, their casualties to be, all of it, to hold an intersection that mattered for reasons that mattered a great deal that season and matter to no one now. The plan was sound. It was always sound. That is the thing about the plans that go wrong. They are almost never stupid, they are just fragile in a place you didn't test. The battalion would move up the Faison Track through the gorge at night, be through the worst of it by first light, and hold the far intersection. Aviation would provide coverage along the route. My aircraft, my scale. I had the coverage laid out to the minute. What the plan did not have was the weather, and what the weather did was close the gorge like a hand. I need to explain this, because if you have never flown a helicopter, you will not feel the size of it. A gun run in open country is a thing you can practice into your bones. A gun run in a gorge is a different animal entirely. The walls take away your escape routes. The winds coming over the ridgelines and down the faces do things that will roll an aircraft into stone before the pilot's hands can answer. And the enemy, if the enemy is smart, and these were smart, puts his weapons up on the high shoulders where he can shoot down into the road, and where an aircraft coming to help has to climb into his fire to reach him. A gorge is a place where the ground troops are in a ditch, and the guns are on the rim, and the sky, which is supposed to be your ally, is a slot barely wider than your rotor disc, full of wind that wants to kill you. That is the country the battalion walked into at 200 on a Saturday, and by 500 the sky had closed. A ceiling came down over the ridgelines, gray and wet and low, and the winds in the gorge went ugly, and my coverage, my beautiful minute-by-minute coverage, could not get into the gorge, because to get into the gorge you had to come down through the slot, into the wind, under the ceiling, with the walls on both sides, and no one on the schedule that morning could fly it. I did not know yet that anyone could. At 5:40, the lead vehicles hit the crater. The enemy had not been idle in the 11 days I spent not thinking about Chief Marsh. They had mined and pre-registered the narrowest bend of the Faison Track, a place where the road pinched between the river and a sheer wall, and they had waited. And when the lead of the battalion's column came around that bend in the gray half-light, they blew the road out from under it. 2 vehicles into the water, a third on its side against the wall, burning. And behind it, strung out along 4 kilometers of a road with a cliff on one side and a river on the other, 837 Marines with nowhere to go. The enemy fire came from the high shoulders, exactly where you would put it, down into the pinned column. Not enough to overrun. They did not have the numbers to come down into the gorge and take on a battalion hand-to-hand, but enough. Enough to keep heads down, to work the length of the column, to turn a road into a shooting gallery and let the arithmetic of a long morning do the rest. The battalion could not go forward. The road was gone. It could not go back fast. The column was too long, the track too narrow, the far end pinched by more fire that had opened up behind them the moment the front blew, sealing them in. They could not scale the walls. They could not ford the Sur, cold and fast with the season's melt. They could hold and bleed and wait for the sky. And the sky was closed. I was in the operations center when the first contact report came in, and I have replayed the next 90 minutes more times than any other 90 minutes of my life. The radio traffic from the gorge was the worst kind, not panic. These were disciplined men, but the flat, fast, clipped cadence of people managing a thing that is getting away from them. Casualty reports. The battalion surgeon's element trying to consolidate wounded under fire in a place with no cover. The commander's voice, steady, asking for air, asking again. The second ask carrying under it the thing the first one didn't. And I could not give it to him. I had aircraft. I want to be clear about that, because the easy version of this story is that we had nothing and she was the only hope, and that is not the truth, and the truth is worse. I had gun birds fueled and armed on the line. What I did not have was a way through the slot. My air boss and I put 2 aircraft up to try, the best crews I had that morning, and they got to the mouth of the gorge and they could not get down into it. The lead came back on the net with his voice tight and told me what I already knew. The ceiling was on the ridgelines, the winds in the slot were rolling 20, 30 knots and shifting, and to fly the gorge you would have to come in below the walls under the ceiling into the wind, and hold the aircraft steady enough to shoot while the mountain tried to throw you into itself. He said he could not do it and keep his crew alive. He was not a coward. He was right. I brought them home. We tried to shape it from above, put fires onto the high shoulders from standoff, from aircraft holding over the top of the ceiling, working off the ground elements' calls. We could not see. You cannot put 30 millimeter onto a shoulder you cannot see, into a gorge you cannot enter, with your own troops 4 kilometers long and 40 meters below the guns you're trying to kill. Every solution I had was a solution for a different problem. Every asset I moved was a weight on a scale that had stopped meaning anything, because the whole architecture I had trusted my whole career assumed a sky you could fly, and this morning there wasn't one. At 7:10, the battalion commander came up on the command net and said, in the flat voice, that he was taking casualties he could not evacuate and could not stop, and that he needed someone to open the high shoulders, or he was going to lose people down the length of the column for as long as the weather held, and the weather was forecast to hold past noon. 5 hours, 837 men, a slot no one could fly. That was when the door of the operations center opened, and Chief Warrant Officer Marsh walked in her flight suit, with her helmet under her arm. "I want to tell you," she asked. She did not ask. Asking was not the shape of what she did, and if you have understood anything about her yet, you already know that. She came and stood at the edge of the map table, and she waited until there was a gap in the traffic, and she said to the room and to me, "I can fly it." The room did not stop the way it does in the movies. War rooms do not stop. They are too busy. But something in it turned toward her, a dozen half-glances, and I felt the turn, and I felt the thing under it, which was that every man in that room who knew the gorge and knew her flying had the same thought at the same instant. And the thought was, yes, she can, and right behind it, in me at least, came the wall of everything I had signed. "You're grounded, Chief," I said. "I know it," she said. She was not arguing. She was stating a condition of the problem, the way you'd state the wind. The ceiling's on the ridgeline at about 300. The slot's got maybe 40 meters of usable width in the pinch, and the wind's coming down the west face and eddying at the second bend. It'll try to set you into the wall on the run-in and lift your tail on the pull-off. You have to fly it slow and low and let it push you and not fight it. And you have to know the bends before you're in them, because you won't see the far one until you're committed to the near one. She said all of this in the flat, even voice, no heat in it. A person reading out a map she had been drawing in her head for 11 days on the flight line, while I filed it as an inability to let go. "Nobody on your schedule this morning has flown that gorge low. I have, 3 times, before all this." I looked at my air boss. My air boss looked at the floor, which is a thing a man does when he agrees with something he is not allowed to say. "There's a review board," I said, and even as it came out of my mouth I heard how small it was, how it was a weight from a scale in a room where the scale had stopped mattering an hour ago. "You put that aircraft in the gorge and it goes wrong. It's on your judgment, and your judgment is exactly what's under review." And she looked at me, not angry. I have to keep saying that because it is the part people don't believe, but she was not angry, she was level. And she said the thing I have carried the longest. "Sir," she said, "there are 837 men in that gorge, and I am the only pilot on this base who can reach them, and you can put me back in front of that board tomorrow and I'll answer for every second of it. But I'm going to be in the air before you finish deciding whether to let me, because they don't have until you're done deciding." I did not give her permission. I want that on the record, because it is the only thing I did right that morning, and it is a strange thing to be proud of. I did not give her permission because permission was mine to give, and I had not earned the right to give it, having spent it 11 days earlier on a signature. What I did instead was step back from the map table, half a step, enough to clear the path to the door, and I said, "Go." It was not permission. It was a man getting out of the way of something larger than his authority. She knew the difference. She nodded once, the smallest motion, and she was gone through the door before the nod was finished, and my air boss was already on the net clearing the line and rolling fuel and rounds to the aircraft she'd have, because he had known before I did that this was going to happen, and he had wanted it too. I followed her out onto the flight line because I could not do the thing I was built to do, which was manage it from a room and stand it. Some mornings you have to go and watch. The line crew had her aircraft turning by the time she reached it, a lean gray gun bird, rotors starting their slow, heavy sweep, and she went up the side of it the way you go up a thing you have gone up 10,000 times, no wasted motion. And I saw her settle into the front seat and pull the harness, and I saw her hands start moving across the panel, fast and certain. And I understood for the first time, watching those hands, what the range officers meant when they double-checked her scores. She was not hurrying, that was the thing. The whole base was hurrying, and she was moving faster than any of us, and there was no hurry in it, no jerk, no wasted second, only economy, only a person who had removed panic from her hands so completely that speed and calm had become the same motion. Her backseater that morning was a young warrant named Das, a good stick, nowhere near her but steady, and I found out later she'd told him on the intercom before they pulled pitch, "You run the radios and the systems and you call my threats. I'll fly the gorge. If I tell you I'm taking us somewhere that looks wrong, believe me and keep talking." And Das, who I later came to know, told me he had never in his life been so afraid and so certain at the same moment, and that the certainty was hers, and it came through the airframe into him like current. She pulled pitch at 7:24. I watched the aircraft lift, nose down, and go, low and fast toward the mouth of the gorge and the gray ceiling sitting on the ridgelines like a lid, and I stood on the flight line with my hands useless at my sides and did the only thing left to me, which was listen. The command net carried it, and I have the tempo of it in my body still. She came up on the battalion's frequency in the flat, even voice. No call to attention in it, just, "Colwyn ground, this is Ash. I'm inbound your position, single ship coming in low through the slot. Talk to me about your high shoulders, where's it coming from, near to far?" And you could hear it in the half-second before the ground controller answered. You could hear what her voice did to that gorge. 837 men who had been holding in a shooting gallery for an hour and 40 minutes with a closed sky over them. And a woman's voice came up on the net and said, "I'm inbound, single ship, coming in low," and something changed in the cadence of the men who answered her. Not relief. It was too early for relief. It was the thing that comes before relief, which is the return of the possible. The ground controller gave her the shoulders 3 main positions. He called them west near, west far, and the east saddle, working the length of the column, and the west far was the worst because it sat right above the pinch where the road was blown and the wounded were consolidating. She read it back clean, and then she went quiet, and the quiet was her going into the slot. I had 2 aircraft holding over the top, above the ceiling, and their crews could see the gorge on their sensors even though they couldn't fly into it. And one of them, a captain named Reyes, narrated it to me on a discreet freak, because he understood I needed to hear it and could not. And what Reyes narrated, in a voice that got quieter and more careful as it went, was a thing that I have never heard described before or since and have run out of words to do justice to. She brought the aircraft down through the slot at the mouth of the gorge, under the ceiling into the walls, and she did not fight the wind. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. Reyes said you could see the wind grab her on the run-in, coming down the west face and shoving the aircraft toward the east wall, and every instinct in a pilot's hands says fight it, muscle back to center, and she didn't. She let it push her, rode the shove, used the wall of moving air the way a kayaker uses a current, kept the aircraft slow and low in the belly of the slot where the wind was least, and let the gorge itself carry her toward the bend she had memorized 11 days ago on the flight line. "She's a Reyes," said, and stopped and started again. "Sir, she's flying it like she can see the wind. She's not correcting. She's anticipating. She's already leaning the aircraft into the second bend, and the second bend's not. I can't even see it on my sensor yet, and she's already set for it." She flew 4 kilometers of that gorge below the walls, under the ceiling, at a speed slow enough to shoot and fast enough to live, and she did not touch the west wall that wanted her, and she did not let the eddy at the second bend lift her tail into the stone, and she came around the last bend into the pinch where the road was blown and the wounded were down, and the west far shoulder was raining fire into all of it, and she put the gorge behind her and the guns in front of her, and she went to work. The first gun run is the one I will answer for at the end of my life, in the good column, the one thing I was near enough to be a witness to. She came around the bend low, and the west far position was above her, and to her right, up on the shoulder, and the geometry of it was exactly the geometry that had made the whole morning impossible. To shoot the shoulder she had to climb her fire up into it, exposing herself, in a slot with no room to maneuver, with the wind still working her. Any pilot alive would have taken a wide, safe, standoff line and walked rounds in from distance and missed half of them, and given the enemy the seconds they needed to shift and hit her. She did not take the safe line. She flew straight into the pinch, close, under the shoulder, so close that Reyes on the sensor said he thought for a half-second she'd flown into the wall, and from directly under the position, where the enemy gunners could not easily depress their weapons to reach her, and where her own gun had the cleanest possible line up into them, she fired. I heard it on the net. Not the gun, you don't hear the gun on the net, but the ground controller, whose voice broke its flat discipline for the first and only time that morning, and said, "Direct hit, west far's down, west far is down." And under his voice, behind it, a sound I will never forget, which was 800 men who had been pinned in a ditch for 2 hours hearing the fire above them stop. She did not celebrate. There was no whoop on the net, no call, nothing. The gun stopped and her voice came up flat, and even as if she were reading a checklist, which she was, the only checklist that mattered. West fars down, moving to west near. Ground, keep your people flat, I'm coming back down your line. And she pulled the aircraft off the shoulder. Reyes said she used the wind again on the pull-off. Let the eddy that had wanted to kill her on the run-in lift her instead. Turned the mountain's own violence into the energy of her turn. And she went back down the length of the column, low, into the slot, toward the next gun. She killed the west near position on her second pass and the east saddle on her third. And between the passes, she flew the gorge back and forth under the ceiling like it was a thing she'd been born knowing. And every time she came down the column, the fire on the Marine slackened. And every time she pulled off to reposition, the ground controller talked her onto the next threat in a voice getting steadier by the minute. The two of them building something over the net, a rhythm. A machine made of one pilot and 800 riflemen and a controller in a ditch, all of it turning around the flat, even voice saying, moving to the next one, keep your people flat. And the road opened. That is the part I have to make you understand, because the gun runs are the cinema of it, but the opening of the road is the thing that saved the men. Killing the guns on the shoulders did not get the battalion out. The road was still blown at the pinch. What killing the guns did was buy the engineers the one thing they had not had all morning, which was 40 minutes without fire, and in those 40 minutes, with Ash flying a racetrack in the gorge overhead, holding the shoulders down, coming back down the line every time a new weapon so much as winked, the battalion's engineers got up out of the ditch and put a bypass across the crater. A rough one. A cut into the wall and a fill across the gap. The kind of thing that is only possible when no one is shooting at you, and no one was shooting at them because a grounded pilot was flying a gorge. No one could fly, and holding the whole rim silent with one aircraft and a gun. They started moving vehicles across the bypass at 8:10. The wounded first. Then the column, 4 kilometers of it, unspooling through the pinch and up the Faison track toward the far end, and over all of it, back and forth in the slot, the lean gray aircraft, low under the ceiling, turning at the bends, coming down the line every few minutes to remind the shoulders what would happen if they woke up. She took fire doing it. Of course she took fire. Not every gun on those shoulders was in the 3 positions she'd killed, and as the morning war on the enemy tried to get weapons back up onto the rim, and twice Reyes called a new muzzle flash, and twice, before he'd finished the call, Ash was already turning toward it because she'd seen it herself a half-second before the sensor did. On one of those passes she took rounds through the airframe. Das told me later he felt the hits walk up the side of the aircraft. 3 of them hard, and heard one of the caution tones start up, and he called it out. We're hit, I've gotta," and her voice cut across his, flat, even, no rise in it at all. "I feel it. It's flying. Call my next threat. It's flying. Call my next threat." She had rounds through her aircraft and a caution light burning and 800 men moving under her, and she made a decision in the space of a breath that the aircraft would fly until it didn't, and that the men mattered more than the light, and she stayed in the gorge. She stayed in the gorge for 2 hours and 40 minutes, on one engine for the last 40 of them, because one of those hits had done something to the other that the caution light had been trying to tell her about, and she nursed a wounded aircraft back and forth through a slot that had killed better-conditioned machines, and she did not come out, and she did not call for relief, because there was no relief. She was the relief. She was the only one who could fly it, and she knew it, and she stayed. The last vehicle cleared the pinch at 1048. The last vehicle cleared the pinch at 1048, and the ground controller came up on the net and said, "Ash, that's our tail, columns clear of the pinch. We are moving, all elements moving." And there was a silence, and then he said, not in the flat controller's voice anymore, but in his own, "You can come home." And she said, "Roger, coming out," and that was all. Reyes narrated the last of it to me from over the top, and his voice had gone very quiet. He said she flew the gorge out one more time, low, the wounded aircraft shuddering now, the one engine carrying what 2 were built for, and he said she flew it as clean going out as she had coming in, no margin left in the airframe and all the margin in the world in her hands, and she came out of the mouth of the slot into open air at 10:52 and turned for home. She did not make it all the way back to the line under her own power. The wounded engine gave out 3 kilometers short, over flat ground, in weather that had finally started to lift, and she put the aircraft down in a dry field in an auto-rotation so controlled that Das said he did not know they'd lost the engine until they were on the ground, because nothing in the way she flew it told him. She said a dying gun burred into a field with no power and no drama and no sound on the intercom except, at the very end, her voice saying, "Brace, we're down," in the flat, even tone, and then the skids were in the dirt and it was over. I was on the flight line when the word came that she was down in the field, and for the length of one very long breath I did not know if she was alive, and in that breath I understood exactly what I had signed 11 days earlier, and exactly what it would have cost if she'd obeyed it. She was alive. She walked away from the aircraft. She had a burn on her right forearm from where a caution panel had shorted and sparked in the last minutes, a new burn on the arm without the old one, and she was standing in the dry field beside the aircraft she'd flown to death, waiting for the recovery bird when they reached her, and the crew chief who got to her first told me she asked one question before she'd let anyone look at the arm. She asked, "Did they all get out?" They all got out. 837 Marines walked, rolled, and were carried out of the Colwyn Gorge that morning, and the casualty count when it was final was a fraction of what the battalion commander had been starring down at 7:10, and every man who did the arithmetic, and in a task force, everyone does the arithmetic, came to the same number, which was that the difference between the count they had and the count they'd have had was one grounded pilot, who was in the air before I finished deciding whether to let her. The review board was still on the schedule. I want you to sit with that because I had to. She had flown the gorge on a Saturday, and the board that was going to answer the question of her airmanship was still docketed for the following week, and the packet that would go in front of it was the packet I had signed, the one that said reckless, a pattern of aggression, a crew integrity concern. By the strict architecture of the thing, the architecture I had served my whole career, the scale, the paper, the profile, nothing had changed. She had once again flown against a standing order. She had taken an aircraft off the ground while grounded. She had, if you wanted to see it that way, and the paper was built to let you see it that way, done exactly the thing she'd been written up for, only larger. I sat in the plywood room that still smelled of burnt coffee and diesel, with her packet in front of me, and I did the reckoning I should have done 11 days before, and had been too good at my job to do. I had trusted the numbers over the pilot because the numbers do not have pride, but I had had it backward the whole time. The numbers do not have pride, and they do not have judgment either, and they do not have the thing she had, which was the ability to feel a risk entirely and decide anyway, on time, with her hands steady, in a place where the paper had no answers because the paper had never imagined the sky could close. The architecture I had trusted was built for ordinary mornings. It had no line for the Colwyn Gorge, and the pilots who lived entirely inside the architecture, the ones who held north of the ridgeline and waited for clearance, and did what the profile said, were exactly the pilots who could not fly the gorge, because flying the gorge required the one thing the architecture was designed to file as a defect. A person who would look at the standing order and the 837 men and know, in her steady hands, which one was the order that actually mattered. That was not recklessness. I had had a word for it the whole time and used it against her. It was airmanship, the real thing, the whole of a pilot's judgment, and I had signed a paper calling its highest expression a defect, because it would not stay inside lines drawn for lesser pilots. I pulled her packet. I went into the record, the real record, the one the board hadn't wanted, the 11 names from the first village and now the 837 from the gorge, and I found the thing the review had buried, which was that this was not a pattern of a pilot who could not obey. It was a pattern of a pilot who obeyed everything that deserved obeying and broke only the orders that were about to get people killed, and got it right every single time, because her judgment was better than the papers. There was a recommendation in that record from years back, from the fire, from the burn shaped like a birch branch, that had never been acted on. I acted on it. And I wrote a new one in my own hand in the plywood room, and I signed that too, and the second signature cost me more than the first and bought back none of it. But it was mine to give, and this time I had earned the right to give it. I put her back on the schedule, and I wrote, in the endorsement that went up the chain, that Chief Warrant Officer Marsh's judgment was not a liability to this task force but its single greatest asset, that I had been wrong to say otherwise, and that the 837 men of the Colwyn Gorge were the argument, and that I would put my name and my career behind every word of it. Then I went to find her, because there was a thing I owed her that could not go in a packet. She was on the flight line, of course. Where else? In her flight suit, no helmet, the new burn wrapped on her right forearm, watching the recovery crew work on the aircraft they dragged in from the field, the lean gray gun bird with the round holes walked up its side. She was standing the way she stood, the way I finally had a word for a person who has made peace with a thing without agreeing to it. And I understood now that the thing she'd made peace with, 11 days on this same line, was the possibility that she would spend the rest of a good career grounded by men who could not tell the difference between her judgment and its opposite, and that she had decided to stay sharp anyway, behind the glass, in case the glass ever broke. I came and stood beside her, and for a while neither of us said anything, because there are apologies too large for the front of the mouth, and they have to be built up too. I signed your grounding, I said finally. You know that. I know it, she said, level no heat, watching the crew. I was wrong, I said. Not wrong about the paper. The paper was right about the paper. I was wrong about you. I trusted a scale over a pilot, and the scale had no line for this morning, and you did. And 837 men are alive because your judgment was better than mine, and I called it a defect. I had to stop. I put you back on the schedule, and I wrote what I should have written the first time. I don't expect it to square us. I'm telling you so you hear it from me before you hear it from the paper. She was quiet a moment. Then she turned and looked at me level, the way she'd looked at me across the map table when she told me she'd be in the air before I finished deciding, and she said the second thing I have carried the longest. You got out of the way, sir, she said. When it mattered, you got out of the way and you let me go. Most men in that room would have held onto the authority because it was the only thing they had left to hold. You let it go. She looked back at the aircraft. I don't need the apology, but I'll take the schedule. And that not the gun runs, not the gorge, that is the moment I have measured every decision of my life against since. She did not make me pay. She could have. She had every right and all the standing in the world. Instead, she reached past my worst day and found the one thing I'd done right in it, and she named it, and she gave me a way to be a better man than the one who'd signed the paper. That is a kind of strength that has nothing to do with an aircraft. It is the same strength that walked 40 meters at a walk into a fire. It does not need to make you burn to make its point. It just puts the fire out and moves on. They rendered honors on the flight line the next morning. It was not ordered. That is the thing I want to end on. No one on the staff put out a directive. There is no line in any manual for what happened. It happened because word travels in a task force the way the true stories always travel, crew chief to maintainer to rifleman. And by first light every man who could be spared from the battalion that had walked out of the Colwyn Gorge had found a reason to be near the flight line when Chief Warrant Officer Marsh walked out to her aircraft to fly the morning schedule, the schedule I had put her back on. They did not cheer. These were not cheering men, and it was not a cheering thing. As she came down the line in her flight suit with the burn wrapped on her arm, they came to attention, in ones and twos and then in whole ranks, 837 men and the ones who loved them, and they held the salute, and they held it in silence, and she walked the length of it. I have seen a great many salutes in 19 years. Most of them are courtesy, the small change of military life, rendered and returned without a thought. I had never before that morning seen a salute that was paid, offered by men who knew exactly what it cost them to be alive to offer it, held by a battalion that had done the arithmetic and knew the number, given to a pilot they had been told was reckless and unfit and grounded, and who had come anyway, into a gorge no one could fly, and cut them a road out of the mountain with one aircraft and a gun and a pair of steady hands. She walked the line. She did not preen and she did not weep and she did not look at me, and I would not have wanted her to. This was not mine. At the end of the line she stopped, and she turned, and she faced them, and she brought her own hand up and returned it, one salute to all of them. The woman they'd trapped a review board around returning the honors of the 837 she'd flown out of the dark. Then she dropped her hand, and she turned, and she went up the side of her aircraft the way she went up a thing she'd gone up 10,000 times, and she flew the morning schedule. I stood at the edge of it with my hand at the brim of my cover, in the salute I owed and could never fully pay, and I thought about the plywood room and the scale in my head and the 11 days of not thinking, and I understood, finally and for good, the difference between a pilot who stays inside the lines and a pilot who knows which line is the one that matters. We had called her Ash because she walked through fire like it was weather. I had grounded her for it. And on a Saturday in the Colwyn Gorge, 837 men found out what I should have known the day I signed my name, that the thing we'd filed as a defect was the finest airmanship I would see in 19 years, and that some pilots you keep inside the lines, and one or two, once in a career, you thank God you got out of the way of.